The sound of Donna's laughter cut through the hum of the banquet hall like a knife. It wasn't the kind of laughter that made you smile along. It was the kind that made your stomach drop. Gary sat stiffly in his chair, his fingers tightening around the stem of his wine glass. He could feel the weight of the seating chart burning in his pocket, the one he'd spent hours rearranging to avoid this exact scenario. But here they were, at the head table, and Donna was in rare form. "Oh, Gary," she said, her voice dripping with mockery as she leaned into the table, her pearl necklace catching the light. "Tell everyone about your little spy game again. You know, the one where you're saving the world from your basement." The table erupted in awkward chuckles. Gary forced a smile, but his jaw clenched so tight he could feel the ache in his molars. He hated when she called it a little spy game. It wasn't a game, it was a passion project, a side hustle he'd been working on for years, a meticulously designed, spy-themed video game that had already caught the attention of a few indie publishers. But to Donna, it was just another hobby to belittle, another way to remind him he wasn't living up to her expectations. "It's not just a game," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the simmering anger in his chest. "It's a fully functional simulation with—" "Oh, come on, Gary," Donna interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "It's cute, really. But let's be honest, you're not exactly saving lives here. You're just playing pretend." The words stung more than they should have. Gary glanced around the table, catching the pitying looks from their colleagues. He could see the way their eyes flicked between him and Donna, their expressions a mix of discomfort and amusement. Donna thrived in moments like these, center stage, holding court with her sharp tongue and cutting remarks. She was a high school English teacher, after all, and she had a knack for turning every conversation into a performance. But tonight, her performance felt less like entertainment and more like a calculated attack. Gary's mind wandered to the half-finished code he'd left on his laptop earlier that evening. He'd been working on a new level, one inspired by a real-life cybersecurity case he'd solved years ago. It was his way of bridging the gap between his day job and his passion, of proving to himself, and maybe to Donna, that he wasn't just playing pretend. But sitting here now, under the weight of her ridicule, it felt like none of it mattered. As the night dragged on, Donna's jabs only grew more pointed. She mocked his choice of suit. "Did you pick that out in the dark? His career, cybersecurity? Sounds like something out of a bad spy movie. Even his taste in wine, of course you'd go for the cheapest bottle on the menu." Each comment was delivered with a smile, a laugh, a flick of her wrist like she was brushing off a crumb. But Gary could see the underlying edge to her words, the way they were meant to cut, to diminish. By the time dessert was served, Gary had stopped responding altogether. He sat in silence, his untouched plate a stark contrast to Donna's animated gestures. Her pearls glinted under the chandelier, a reminder of everything she represented. Polished, poised, and utterly unattainable. He wondered, not for the first time, how they'd ended up here. They'd been married for 15 years, raised a son together, built a life. But somewhere along the way, the woman he'd fallen in love with had become a stranger. As the evening wound down, Gary excused himself to the restroom. He stood at the sink, staring at his reflection in the mirror, the faint sound of Donna's laughter still echoing in his ears. He thought about the half-finished game waiting for him at home, the code he'd been so proud of just hours ago. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he deserved better than this. But as he walked back to the table, he caught a glimpse of Donna leaning in close to one of the guests, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Her laughter was softer now, more intimate, and there was a glint in her eye that Gary couldn't quite place. He paused, watching her for a moment longer than he should have, before forcing himself to sit back down. The night wasn't over yet, and neither, it seemed, was the performance. The house smelled like burnt lasagna and unspoken resentment. Gary sat at the dining table, staring at his plate, the food untouched and congealing into something vaguely geological. Donna's voice carried from the living room, sharp and self-satisfied, as she chatted with a group of parents from Ethan's school. They'd come over under the guise of discussing some fundraiser, but Gary knew better. This was Donna's stage and she was the star. "Oh, you must read his latest novel," Donna was saying, her tone dripping with the kind of condescension that made Gary's jaw tighten. "It's pure genius. I've been corresponding with him, you know. He's quite taken with my insights. Gary stabbed a fork into his lasagna, the cheese stretching like it was mocking him. He glanced at the autographed book on the coffee table, its glossy cover catching the light. Donna had been carrying it around like a trophy for weeks, flipping through the pages with a reverence she'd never shown for anything Gary had done. Not his work in cybersecurity, not the spy-themed video game he'd been developing in his spare time, nothing. "Gary?" Donna called, her voice slicing through his thoughts. "Could you bring in some more wine? We're celebrating." "Celebrating what, exactly?" He didn't ask, just pushed his chair back and went to the kitchen, where the bottle of Cabernet sat half-empty on the counter. He poured it into a decanter, the rich red liquid swirling like blood. The sound of Donna's laughter drifted in, high and artificial, and he felt a pang of something bitter in his chest. He returned to the living room, decanter in hand, and caught the tail end of Donna's monologue. "And of course, Gary's work is technical," she said, her lips curling around the word like it was a joke. "But I've always been the creative one in the family." The parents chuckled politely, their eyes flicking to Gary as he set the decanter down. He forced a smile, the kind that felt like it might crack his face in half, and retreated to the dining room. The lasagna was still there, cold and unappetizing, but it was better than the alternative. Later, after the parents had left and the house was quiet, Gary found Donna's book club schedule on the kitchen counter. It was meticulously highlighted, every meeting and event marked in fluorescent yellow. He noticed something else, too. A new edition scribbled in the margins. "Meeting with J Hotel, 7 p.m. The handwriting was hurried, almost secretive, and it made his stomach twist. Donna appeared in the doorway, her pearl necklace catching the light. "You didn't eat," she said, nodding at his plate. "Not hungry," Gary replied, his voice flat. She sighed, the kind of sigh that meant he was being difficult. "You should really try to be more social, Gary. It's important for Ethan to see us as a united front." He wanted to say something, about how she'd undermined him in front of their guests, about how she'd dismissed his work like it was nothing, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he picked up the schedule and held it out to her. "What's this?" Her eyes flicked to the page, then back to him. "Just a meeting," she said, too quickly. "With the book club." "Why?" He didn't answer, just watched as she took the schedule and folded it neatly, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. There was a moment of silence, heavy and loaded, before she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the tile. Gary sat back down at the table, the untouched lasagna still mocking him. He stared at the autographed book on the coffee table, its glossy cover gleaming in the dim light. For the first time, he wondered if Donna's obsession with her literary connections had less to do with books and more to do with the man who'd written them. The kitchen smelled like burnt coffee and regret. I was sitting at the table, staring at the dregs of my third cup, when Ethan shuffled in. He was wearing that hoodie he never takes off, the one with the faded logo of some band I don't recognize. His face was pale, and his eyes darted around like he was trying to figure out how to start a conversation I didn't want to have. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking in that way it does when he's nervous. I need to tell you something." I put the mug down, the ceramic clinking against the table. "What's up, bud?" He hesitated, chewing on his bottom lip. Then he pulled out the chair across from me and sat down, his hands fidgeting with the drawstrings of his hoodie. "It's about Mom." My stomach tightened. Donna had been different lately, distant. She'd been spending more time at her book club meetings. Coming home late with her hair slightly messy, her makeup smudged. I chalked it up to stress or maybe midlife crisis stuff. But the way Ethan was looking at me, like he was about to drop a bomb, made me realize I'd been fooling myself. "Last night," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I heard her on the phone. She thought I was asleep, but I wasn't. She was whispering about meeting someone at a hotel. She said they had to keep it secret." The room felt like it was tilting. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. "Are you sure that's what you heard?" He nodded, his eyes wide and serious. "She said his name, too. It was that guy, the one who came to her book club last month. The novelist." I remembered that guy. Tall, pretentious, with the kind of smirk that made you want to punch him. Donna had gushed about him for weeks afterward, talking about how brilliant his writing was, how inspiring his lectures were. I tuned most of it out, too busy with work and my own projects to care. But now, the memory of her fawning over him made my skin crawl. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled napkin. I found this in the trash. Mom wrote a number on it. I think it's his. I took the napkin from him, my hands trembling. The number was scrawled in Donna's loopy handwriting, the kind she uses when she's in a hurry. My chest felt like it was caving in, but I forced myself to stay calm. For Ethan. Thanks for telling me, I said, my voice steady even though my insides were a mess. I'll handle it, okay? You don't need to worry about this. He nodded, but the worry didn't leave his face. I don't want things to get messed up, you know? I know, bud. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. We'll figure it out. After he left, I sat there for a long time, staring at the napkin. The coffee had gone cold, and the smell of it was making me nauseous. I grabbed my encrypted laptop from the counter and opened it, my fingers moving on autopilot. If Donna thought she could hide this from me, she was wrong. I'd spent my career tracking down people who didn't want to be found. She might have been good at keeping secrets, but I was better at uncovering them. I started with the number. It didn't take long to trace it back to the novelist, some hack who'd written a couple of mediocre thrillers and fancied himself a literary genius. His social media was full of pretentious quotes and photos of him sipping whiskey in dimly lit bars. There were even a few tagged posts with Donna, her smile too bright, her laughter too forced. The more I dug, the more the pieces fell into place. Hotel reservations, late-night texts, money transfers from our joint account to some shady offshore account. It was all there, laid out in front of me like a puzzle I didn't want to solve. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, my head spinning. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the fridge, but inside my head, it was chaos. Anger, disbelief, betrayal. It all swirled together, making it hard to breathe. But underneath it all, there was something else. Resolve. If Donna thought she could play me for a fool, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. I wasn't going to let her destroy our family without a fight. I grabbed my phone and sent a quick text to my lawyer. Then I stood up, walked to the sink, and poured the cold coffee down the drain. The smell lingered, but I didn't care. I had work to do. The glow of Gary's laptop screen was the only light in the room, casting long shadows across the wall as he sat hunched over the keyboard. His hands moved with the precision of someone who'd spent years navigating the dark corners of the internet. But tonight, the stakes were personal. The faint smell of stale coffee lingered in the air, a testament to the hours he'd spent combing through digital breadcrumbs. Donna had always been careless with her passwords. Too poetic to be practical, she'd once joked, but Gary had never found it funny. Now, her carelessness was his key. He'd found it earlier that evening. A forgotten sticky note tucked into the spine of her planner, the words Novelist Louvre 23, scrawled in her looping handwriting. It took him less than 10 minutes to crack into her secret email account. The inbox was a graveyard of deceit. Threads of emails stretched back months, each one a dagger twisting deeper into his chest. The novelist, some pretentious hack named Julian, had been pouring his literary cliches into Donna's inbox like cheap wine. Your eyes are like sonnets, one email began, and Gary had to stifle a bitter laugh. Donna had always mocked his spy games, called them juvenile, but this was the kind of melodrama she couldn't resist. He scrolled further, his jaw tightening as he pieced together the timeline. Weekend getaways, stolen moments in hotel rooms, whispered promises of a future together. Gary's stomach churned as he read Julian's description of their last encounter. The details so vivid they burned into his mind. He slammed the laptop shut, the sound echoing in the quiet room. His hands trembled as he reached for the whiteboard he'd set up in the corner, the one he'd been using to map out his findings. The evidence was undeniable. Donna hadn't just betrayed him emotionally. She'd been siphoning money from their joint account. Small withdrawals at first, $200 here, $300 there, but they'd added up. Gary traced the transactions back to their source, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he pulled up bank statements. The payments were always made on Fridays, just before Donna's so-called book club meetings. He'd never questioned it before. Now, the pattern was as clear as the half-packed suitcase he'd found in her closet earlier that day. Gary's mind raced as he connected the dots. The suitcase had been tucked behind a stack of winter coats, its contents hastily thrown together. A silk blouse, a pair of heels, a bottle of perfume he didn't recognize. He'd stared at it for a long time, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him like a physical force. Then, methodical as ever, he'd taken a photo and added it to the growing pile of evidence. By midnight, the whiteboard was a mosaic of Donna's lies. Dates, times, locations, all meticulously catalogued. Gary stepped back, his eyes scanning the board. His chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped a vice around his ribs, but beneath the anger was a strange, hollow calm. He'd always been good at solving puzzles, at seeing the bigger picture. Now, the picture was painfully clear. He opened the laptop again, this time navigating to Donna's email drafts folder. There, he found the final piece of the puzzle, a half-finished message to Julian, detailing her plan to leave Gary and take half their assets. The words were cold, calculating, a stark contrast to the flowery prose she used in her other emails. Gary read it twice, his hands curling into fists. Then, without hesitation, he hit Save Draft and closed the laptop. The room was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Gary leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He'd always prided himself on being rational, on keeping his emotions in check. But tonight, as the weight of Donna's betrayal settled over him, he allowed himself one moment of raw, unfiltered anger. His fist slammed against the desk, the sound sharp and final. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the anger faded, replaced by a steely resolve. Gary stood, his movements deliberate. He had all the evidence he needed. Now it was time to decide what to do with it. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like it's holding its breath. Gary sat at the kitchen table, the printed emails fanned out in front of him like a bad hand of cards. He'd rehearsed this moment in his head 100 times, but now that it was here, his chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped a belt around his ribs and was slowly tightening it. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, each second slicing through the silence. Donna walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. She was still in her work clothes, a sleek blouse and skirt, her pearl necklace catching the light. She stopped when she saw him, her eyes darting to the papers on the table. For a split second, her face flickered with something. Panic? Maybe. But then it was gone, replaced by that cool, practiced smile she always wore when she was about to deflect. Gary, she said, her voice smooth as glass. What's all this? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he folded his arms across his chest, his fingers digging into his biceps. He wanted to stay calm, to keep his voice steady, but the anger was already simmering, threatening to boil over. Sit down, he said, his tone flat. She hesitated, then pulled out a chair, sitting across from him. Her mascara was perfect, not a smudge in sight, but he knew that wouldn't last long. He slid one of the printed emails toward her, watching her face as she scanned it. Her jaw tightened just a fraction, but she didn't look up. Gary, she said again, this time with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. This is ridiculous. You're really going to believe some hacked emails? Do you even know how easy it is to fake these things? He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. Don't, he said, his voice low. Don't even try that. I'm not some idiot you can gaslight. I know what I'm looking at. I know what you've been doing. Her smile faltered, but she recovered quickly, leaning back in her chair like she was the one in control. Okay, fine. Let's say these are real. So what? People flirt? Gary, it doesn't mean anything. You're blowing this way out of proportion. He wanted to laugh, but it came out as a bitter snort. Flirt? Donna, this isn't flirting. This is you planning a weekend getaway with him. This is you talking about how much you want him. Don't insult me by pretending it's anything less than what it is. Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time he saw a crack in her armor. You're really going to do this? You're really going to sit here and judge me? What about you, Gary? What about all those nights you spent locked in your office, ignoring me and Ethan? What about your precious video games that were always more important than your family? He didn't flinch. This isn't about me. This is about you lying, about you cheating, about you taking money from our account to fund your little affair. Don't try to turn this around. She opened her mouth to argue, But he cut her off, his voice rising. And don't even think about bringing Ethan into this. He's the only good thing to come out of this mess, and I'll be damned if I let you use him as a pawn. For a moment, she just stared at him, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, like a switch had been flipped, her eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the table, her fingers brushing his arm. "Gary, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I made a mistake. I know I did. But we can fix this. We can work through it. You don't want to throw away everything we've built, do you?" He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time he saw the cracks in her facade. Her mascara was starting to smudge, her perfect composure unraveling. But he didn't feel pity. He didn't feel regret. All he felt was a cold, hard certainty. "It's too late for that," he said, his voice steady. "You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." She pulled her hand back like she'd been burned, her tears drying up as quickly as they'd come. "Fine," she snapped, her voice sharp now. "If that's how you want to play it, then fine. But don't think for a second that you're going to come out of this looking like the good guy. I'll make sure everyone knows the truth." He stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Go ahead," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Tell them whatever you want. But the truth is already out there, Donna. And it's not on my side. It's on yours." She didn't say anything as he walked out of the room, the printed emails still scattered across the table. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The decision was made, and for the first time in a long time he felt like he could breathe again. Ethan knocked on the door of Gary's home office, his face pale but resolute. The faint glow of Gary's monitor cast shadows across the room, illuminating the stacks of printed emails and financial records scattered across the desk. Gary looked up, his eyes bloodshot from hours of staring at the screen, and saw something in his son's expression that made his chest tighten. "Dad," Ethan said quietly, holding up a small USB drive. It was one of Gary's old ones, a novelty item with a spy logo etched into the metal. Gary had given it to Ethan years ago as a joke when he'd started teaching him basic coding. Now it felt like a relic from another life. "What's this?" Gary asked, though he already knew. The weight in Ethan's voice told him everything. Ethan stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He placed the USB drive on the desk, next to Donna's discarded phone case. A cracked, glittery thing she'd replaced just last week. "I found something," Ethan said, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly. "I used that data recovery tool you showed me. Mom's texts. The ones she deleted. I got them back." Gary's breath caught. He stared at the USB drive, its spy logo gleaming under the desk lamp. For a moment, he couldn't bring himself to touch it. The room felt too quiet, the air too heavy, like the calm before a storm. Ethan's determined smile, small, fragile, but there, was the only thing grounding him. "Ethan," Gary began, his voice rough. "You shouldn't have. I had to, Dad." Ethan interrupted, his tone firm. "She's been lying to you, to both of us. I couldn't just sit there and do nothing." Gary's heart ached at the anger in his son's voice, the betrayal etched into his features. He reached for the USB drive, his fingers brushing against it as if it might burn him. When he plugged it in, the files loaded almost instantly. Ethan had organized them neatly, dates, times, everything labeled with a precision that made Gary both proud and sick to his stomach. The texts were worse than he'd imagined. Donna hadn't just been planning to leave him. She'd been meticulously plotting it for months. There were messages to the novelist, full of promises and plans for their new life together. But it was the financial discussions that made Gary's stomach churn. Donna had been consulting with a lawyer, mapping out how to maximize her share of their assets. Half the house, half the savings, even half of Gary's retirement fund. Gary's jaw tightened as he read through the messages, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He could feel Ethan watching him, waiting for some kind of reaction. But Gary couldn't speak. Not yet. His mind raced, piecing together the timeline, the lies, the sheer audacity of it all. "Dad?" Ethan said after a long silence, his voice breaking just a little. "What are we going to do?" Gary exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. He looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw the boy he'd raised, now a young man standing tall in the face of something no kid should ever have to deal with. Ethan's loyalty, His quiet determination was a lifeline Gary hadn't realized he needed. "We're going to fight," Gary said finally, his voice steady. "Not just for the money or the house. For us. For everything she tried to take away." Ethan nodded, his smile growing a little stronger. "Good. Because I'm not letting her win." Gary reached out, squeezing his son's shoulder. The USB drive sat between them, its spy logo a silent reminder of the lessons Gary had taught Ethan over the years. Lessons about trust, about resilience, about standing up for what's right. And now Ethan had turned those lessons into action. As Gary scrolled through the rest of the messages, a plan began to form in his mind. Donna had underestimated him, underestimated both of them. She thought she could walk away unscathed, leaving destruction in her wake. But Gary wasn't going to let that happen. Not this time. The USB drive wasn't just evidence. It was a weapon, and Gary knew exactly how to use it. The conference room smelled faintly of stale coffee and printer toner. Gary sat with his back straight, his hands resting on the table, fingers interlaced. Across from him, Donna fidgeted with the hem of her blazer, her nails, still perfectly manicured, he noticed, tapping against the edge of the polished wood. She had that look in her eye, the one she always got when she thought she was winning. That smug, half-smirk that used to make his stomach twist. Not today. Today, Gary felt nothing but a cold, steady resolve. The lawyer, a wiry man with a voice like gravel, cleared his throat and slid a stack of papers across the table. Donna's eyes flicked down, and for a moment her smirk faltered. Gary didn't need to see the documents to know what they contained. He'd spent weeks piecing it all together. The emails, the bank transfers, the late-night texts Ethan had recovered. Every last detail was there, laid out in black and white. "Mrs. Thompson," the lawyer began, his tone clipped and professional. "We've compiled a comprehensive report detailing the financial discrepancies in your shared accounts, as well as evidence of your extracurricular activities." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like a storm cloud. Donna's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, her knuckles whitening. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice sharp but wavering. "Gary, you can't possibly believe this nonsense. You're just trying to punish me because you're jealous. Because you can't handle that I've moved on." Gary didn't flinch. He'd expected this, the deflection, the blame shifting. It was her go-to move, the one she'd perfected over years of twisting arguments in her favor. But this wasn't an argument. This was the endgame. "Jealous?" he said quietly, his voice steady. "No, Donna. This isn't about jealousy. This is about the fact that you've been lying to me, to Ethan, to everyone. And now it's time to face the consequences." The lawyer tapped the stack of papers. "Mrs. Thompson, the evidence here is indisputable. The unauthorized withdrawals, the hotel receipts, the correspondence with Mr. Carver, it's all here. If this goes to court, it won't end well for you." Donna's eyes darted between Gary and the lawyer, her bravado crumbling piece by piece. Her trembling hands betrayed her, though she tried to hide them under the table. "You can't do this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You can't just destroy me like this." "Destroy you?" Gary leaned forward, his gaze locking onto hers. "You did that yourself, Donna. Every lie, every betrayal, that was you. Not me." For a moment, she looked like she might argue, might try to spin another story, but then her shoulders slumped, and the fight drained out of her. She stared at the papers in front of her, her fingers brushing the edge of a highlighted bank statement. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "We want a fair settlement," the lawyer said, sliding another document toward her. "One that reflects the damage you've caused, and one that ensures Gary and Ethan are taken care of." Donna's lips pressed into a thin line, her face pale. She reached for the pen the lawyer offered, her hand shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. Gary watched as she signed, her signature sloppy and uneven. When she was done, she pushed the papers away like they were toxic, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The lawyer gathered the documents, his expression unreadable. "I'll file these immediately," he said, standing. "We'll be in touch with next steps." As he left the room, Donna sat frozen, her hands clenched in her lap. Gary stood, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him like a heavy blanket. He didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. At the door, he paused and glanced back at her. She looked small, fragile even, sitting there in her designer blazer and pearls. For a fleeting moment, he felt a pang of something. Pity, maybe, or regret. But then he remembered the nights he'd spent alone. The way she'd laughed at him in front of their friends. The way she'd tried to manipulate Ethan into taking her side. No, he thought, stepping into the hallway. She made her choices. Now she'll live with them. The door clicked shut behind him, and Gary took a deep breath, the air feeling cleaner, lighter somehow. It wasn't over, not yet. But for the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe again. The literary club event was held in a dimly lit bookstore that smelled of old paper and overpriced coffee. The kind of place where people spoke in hushed tones about craft and character arcs, like they were discussing state secrets. Gary stood near the back, his hands in his pockets, his calm smile barely visible in the flicker of the Edison bulbs overhead. He hadn't been invited, of course. Donna had made that abundantly clear when she'd left that morning, clutching her leather-bound notebook and muttering something about networking opportunities. But Gary wasn't there to crash her party. He was there to watch it burn. Donna was at the center of the room, her pearl necklace catching the light as she laughed a little too loudly at something the visiting novelist, a pretentious man named Julian, had just said. Julian was the kind of guy who wore scarves indoors and used words like zeitgeist, unironically. Gary had read his latest book, or tried to anyway. It was a meandering mess about a tortured artist who falls for his student. Real original. As Gary sipped his lukewarm coffee, he caught snippets of Donna's conversation. She was gushing about Julian's profound insights and masterful prose, her voice dripping with the kind of sycophantic enthusiasm she'd never once shown for Gary's work. It was almost impressive how easily she could switch on the charm when it suited her. Almost. Then Julian leaned in, his voice carrying just enough for Gary to hear. Donna, darling, you must tell me. How do you juggle your teaching with your extracurricular activities? He winked, and Donna's face flushed a deep crimson. She laughed nervously, but the sound was brittle, like glass about to shatter. Gary's calm smile widened. He stepped forward, his presence cutting through the chatter like a knife. Extracurricular activities? He asked, his tone light but laced with something sharper. Donna, you didn't tell me you were taking up a new hobby. Donna froze, her glass of wine halfway to her lips. Julian, oblivious to the tension, chuckled and clapped Gary on the shoulder. Ah, you must be Donna's husband. She's been telling me all about you. Oh, I'm sure she has, Gary said, his eyes never leaving Donna's face. But I'm curious, what exactly has she said? Because I've been hearing some interesting things myself. The room seemed to hold its breath. Donna's flush deepened, and she set her glass down with a trembling hand. Gary, she said, her voice tight, this really isn't the time or place. On the contrary, Gary replied, his tone still deceptively calm. I think this is the perfect time and place. After all, isn't that what these events are for? Sharing stories. Julian, finally picking up on the tension, cleared his throat and tried to steer the conversation back to safer waters. Well, speaking of stories, my latest novel explores the complexities of modern relationships. Complexities, Gary interrupted, his smile never wavering. That's one way to put it. I call it more of a cautionary tale, about what happens when people get too caught up in their own fantasies and forget about the people they're supposed to care about. Donna's face was a mask of panic now, her carefully constructed facade cracking under the weight of Gary's words. Julian, still clueless, laughed awkwardly and tried to change the subject again, but the damage was done. The other guests were whispering, their eyes darting between Gary and Donna like spectators at a car crash. Gary didn't stay long after that. He didn't need to. The look on Donna's face, part fury, part desperation, told him everything he needed to know. As he walked out into the cool night air, he couldn't help but laugh. The irony wasn't lost on him. In a room full of people who made their living off of stories, Donna's had just unraveled in the most public way possible. And Gary? He was just getting started. The living room smelled like pepperoni and melted cheese, the kind of greasy comfort food that felt like a warm blanket after a storm. Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, his controller in hand, eyes glued to the TV screen where their spy character crouched behind a digital crate. Gary leaned back on the couch, his own controller resting on his knee, watching his son more than the game. Ethan's face was lit up with that same wide-eyed excitement Gary remembered from when he was 6, building pillow forts and pretending they were secret bases. "Dad, look out! The sniper's on the roof!" Ethan's voice crackled with urgency, snapping Gary back to the present. He fumbled with the controller, but it was too late. Their character got picked off in a burst of pixelated blood. Ethan groaned, but it was the kind of groan that came with a grin. "You're so bad at this," he teased, shoving a slice of pizza into his mouth. Gary laughed, a real laugh that felt strange but good, like stretching a muscle he hadn't used in years. "Hey, I'm rusty. Okay? Give me a break." They restarted the level, and this time Gary paid attention. The game was one they'd been working on together for months. A spy thriller where the player had to outsmart enemies and solve puzzles. It was Ethan's idea to add a father-son duo as the main characters, and Gary had run with it, coding late into the night when the house was quiet and his thoughts were loud. Now, playing through the levels with Ethan felt like stepping into a world where they could rewrite their story. "So, what's next for the game?" Gary asked, navigating their character through a maze of laser traps. Ethan's eyes lit up. "I was thinking we could add a twist where the dad has to save the son for once. You know, like the kid gets captured, and the dad has to go full spy mode to rescue him." Gary paused the game and turned to Ethan. "You've been thinking about that a lot, huh?" Ethan shrugged, but his smile faltered for a second. "Yeah, I guess. It's just, it'd be cool, you know? Seeing the dad step up like that." Gary felt a lump in his throat. He reached over and ruffled Ethan's hair, the way he used to when Ethan was little. "You don't need a game to know I do that for you, kid. Anytime, anywhere." Ethan ducked his head, but Gary could see the corners of his mouth twitching upward. "Yeah, I know. It's just fun to imagine, right?" They kept playing, the conversation shifting to lighter topics: school, Ethan's friends, the latest updates to the game. But Gary couldn't shake the weight of Ethan's words. He'd spent so much time worrying about Donna, about the divorce, about everything that had gone wrong, that he hadn't fully realized how much Ethan had been carrying too. The kid had been quiet these past few months, retreating into his room more often than not, and Gary had chalked it up to teenage moodiness. Now, he wondered how much of it was Ethan trying to protect him, the same way Gary had been trying to shield Ethan from the mess. "Hey," Gary said, unpausing the game. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right? No matter what's going on. I'm here for you." Ethan nodded, his focus still on the screen. "I know, Dad. I just didn't want to make things harder for you." Gary's chest tightened. "You're not making anything harder, Ethan. You're my kid. My job is to make sure you're okay, no matter what." Ethan glanced at him, his expression softer now. "Thanks, Dad." They kept playing, the pizza growing cold and the hours slipping by. By the time they finally turned off the console, the living room was bathed in the dim glow of the TV's standby light. Ethan yawned, stretching his arms above his head. "That was fun. We should do this more often." "Yeah," Gary said, standing up and gathering the empty pizza box. "We should." As he walked Ethan to his room, Gary felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that came with grand gestures or easy fixes. It was quieter, steadier, the kind that grew from small moments like these. He knew there were still hard days ahead, but for the first time in months, he felt like they might actually make it through. "Night, Dad?" Ethan said, slipping into his room. "Night, kiddo," Gary replied, closing the door gently behind him. He stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of Ethan shuffling around, getting ready for bed. Then he turned and headed back to the living room, where the remnants of their night still lingered. The greasy pizza box, the controllers on the floor, the faint hum of the TV. He sat down on the couch, staring at the blank screen. For the first time in what felt like forever, the house didn't feel empty. It felt like theirs. The glow from my laptop screen was the only light in the room as I sat at the dining table. Donna's empty chair staring back at me like a ghost. I hadn't moved it, didn't want to. It was a reminder, not of her, but of what I'd survived. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, the cursor blinking impatiently in the empty text box. Reddit's r/relationship advice stared back at me. A digital confessional where strangers spilled their guts and sought solace. Tonight it was my turn. Ethan wandered in, a slice of pizza in one hand and his gaming controller in the other. "You still working on that post, Dad?" he asked, plopping down on the couch. His voice carried a mix of curiosity and pride, the kind that only a teenager who just helped his old man uncover a life-altering betrayal could muster. I glanced at him, at the way his face had lost that pinched, worried look he'd been wearing for months. He looked like a kid again, like my kid. "Yeah," I said, my voice rough, trying to figure out how to say it without sounding like a Lifetime movie. He snorted. "Just tell it like it is. You're the one who always says, the truth doesn't need a script." Damn, the kid was right. I turned back to the screen and started typing. The words came easier than I expected, like they'd been waiting for this moment. I didn't sugarcoat it. I didn't need to. The details were brutal: Donna's public humiliations, the late-night whispers, the emails, the money, the lies. But it wasn't just about her. It was about me, about how I'd let her chip away at me, piece by piece, until I didn't recognize the man in the mirror. I paused, my fingers resting on the keys. The smell of pepperoni and melted cheese wafted over from Ethan's pizza, grounding me in the moment. I could hear the faint hum of the gaming console in the background, the sound of a world where the good guys always won in the end. Maybe that's why I'd always loved video games. They made sense in a way real life didn't. But real life had given me something no game ever could: my son. And that was worth every second of the fight. I finished the post with a simple piece of advice. Don't let anyone make you small. Not your partner, not your job, not your doubts. You're worth more than that. And if you don't believe it, find someone who does. For me, it was my kid. For you, it might be a friend, a parent, or even a stranger on the internet. Just don't give up on yourself. I hit post before I could second-guess it. The screen refreshed, and there it was, my story out in the wild. A part of me expected to feel exposed, vulnerable. Instead, I felt lighter, like I'd finally let go of something I didn't even realize I'd been carrying. Ethan wandered over, peering at the screen. "You're gonna blow up Reddit, Dad," he said with a grin. "They're gonna love this." I chuckled, the sound rusty but genuine. "Maybe. Or maybe it'll just get lost in the noise. Either way, it's out there." He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that felt oddly grown-up coming from him. "You did good, Dad." I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the last few months settling into something manageable. The empty chair across from me didn't feel like a ghost anymore. It felt like a space that needed filling, not with Donna, but with something better. Maybe it was time to move it, or maybe it was time to get a new table altogether. Ethan flopped back onto the couch, his controller in hand. "Wanna play around? I'll go easy on you." I laughed, the sound surprising both of us. "In your dreams, kid." As I grabbed my own controller and joined him, I realized something. I wasn't just rebuilding my life. I was building a new one. And this time I wasn't going to let anyone, not Donna, not anyone, make me forget my worth. The game loaded, and for the first time in a long time I felt like I was winning. Not just in the game, but in life. And that was a victory worth savoring.